Frank Lucas called Bumpy Johnson his mentor. Bumpy's widow called Lucas a flunky. Both men knew the same legend. They just remembered their relationship very differently. March 1930. Harlem was already awake before the sun came up. The elevated train shook the windows along Lenox Avenue. Delivery trucks rattled over broken pavement. Storefront gates were still coming up when the first runners began moving through the streets. Nobody called it an empire. Not yet. It was numbers. 3 digits written on slips of paper. Nickels and dimes passed across counters. Bets carried from barber shops to pool halls, from restaurants to apartment buildings. The numbers game looked small from the sidewalk. It wasn't. By the middle of the 20th century, Harlem's numbers racket had become a massive underground economy, generating tens of millions of dollars and supporting thousands of people. The game was one of the rare major businesses in New York that had developed largely under black control. And that made Harlem valuable. Very valuable. Outside the neighborhood, men were beginning to notice Italian gangsters, Jewish gangsters, men who understood that money did not care what color the neighborhood was. If Harlem was producing money, somebody wanted a piece of it. And one of the men standing between them and that money was a woman. Stephanie St. Clair, Madame Queen. She was one of Harlem's most powerful numbers operators. And when Dutch Schultz began pushing into Harlem, she refused to simply hand over what she had built. She needed someone willing to stand in the street when the shooting started. That man was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy. He was young. He was already dangerous. But danger alone didn't make him different. Plenty of men in Harlem could fight. Plenty could shoot. Plenty could threaten. Bumpy had something else. He could wait. And in Harlem, waiting could be more valuable than a gun. The streets were changing. Dutch Schultz's organization was pushing into the numbers business. The conflict became violent, and Bumpy emerged as one of St. Clair's most important enforcers. The struggle would eventually reshape who controlled Harlem's gambling economy. Bumpy learned something during those years. Power wasn't always the man holding the weapon. Sometimes power was the man everybody looked at before deciding whether to use one. That distinction would follow him for decades, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't building a reputation as a street corner thug. He was building a position, and position mattered in Harlem. By the middle of the 1930s, the war around the numbers racket had become impossible to ignore. Businesses knew which side they were supposed to pay. Runners knew which streets were safe. Polis knew which names mattered, and Bumpy knew that Harlem couldn't survive forever as a battlefield. Then Dutch Schultz was murdered in 1935. The shooting changed the balance. The larger New York Mafia had no interest in a prolonged war that disrupted business. A new arrangement emerged in which Harlem's operators could continue working while the larger organized crime structure took its share. Bumpy negotiated within that new order and began building his own organization. That was the beginning of the Bumpy Johnson people would remember, not because he suddenly became king, because he learned how to survive around kings. Italian bosses could have more men. Politicians could have more influence. Polis could have badges. Bumpy had Harlem, and Harlem had a memory. People remembered who had stood there when somebody else came looking for their money. That kind of reputation couldn't be bought easily. It had to be earned. One street at a time, one favor at a time, one problem at a time, and sometimes one body at a time. But there was another side to Bumpy that later versions of his story often flattened. He wasn't simply a man who walked into a room and frightened everybody. He was a man who understood rooms. He knew who was sitting where, who owed whom, who was lying, who was nervous, who was watching the door. That mattered because Harlem was not isolated from the rest of New York. It was connected to it. Money moved, information moved, people moved. And the men who controlled Harlem's illegal economy had to deal with organizations much larger than anything one neighborhood could produce. Bumpy survived because he understood that. Then came Prison 1952. Bumpy was convicted in a federal narcotics case and eventually began serving a 15-year sentence. He spent much of that time at Alcatraz before being paroled in 1963. That sentence is more than a date in a biography. It changes the entire Frank Lucas story, because Frank Lucas would later describe himself as Bumpy's driver and right-hand man for 15 years. But Bumpy was not free for 15 years. He was behind bars for most of them. The timeline doesn't disappear because a movie needs it to. It stays there, cold, uncomfortable waiting. And while Bumpy was away, Harlem kept moving. New drugs, new money, new players, new loyalties. The neighborhood Bumpy had known before prison was becoming something else. And somewhere inside that changing Harlem was a young man from North Carolina, Frank Lucas. He had arrived in New York after growing up in LaGrange, North Carolina, and after a series of experiences that pushed him toward crime. In Harlem, he began with smaller hustles before eventually coming into Bumpy Johnson's orbit. This is where the story becomes difficult, because everybody agrees on one thing. Frank knew Bumpy. Almost everything after that becomes disputed. Lucas later said Bumpy took him under his wing. He described Bumpy as a mentor. He said Bumpy protected him. He even called himself Bumpy's right-hand man. But Mame Johnson remembered something very different. And she had been married to Bumpy since 1948. She knew the people who came through their home. She knew who sat at the dinner table. She knew who Bumpy trusted. Years later, she said Frank Lucas was never accepted into Bumpy's inner circle. She described Lucas as someone who followed Bumpy and held his coat. Not the powerful lieutenant depicted in later accounts. That's the first crack in the legend. And it is a big one, because proximity isn't the same as trust. Watching a powerful man isn't the same as being taught by him. And standing near the door isn't the same as owning the room. 1963 Bumpy came home. 11 years had passed since the sentence that had taken him away from Harlem. The city was different. So was Harlem. Bumpy was older, the streets were younger, and the drug trade was becoming more important than the old numbers racket. This was the world Frank Lucas was entering. Not the Harlem of 1935. Not the Harlem Bumpy had conquered as a young man. A harder Harlem, a more dangerous Harlem. A Harlem where heroin could move enormous amounts of money through networks that crossed oceans. Bumpy understood the old system. Lucas was looking toward the new one. For a brief period, their paths overlapped. That part is real. The question is what happened inside that overlap. Did Bumpy see Lucas as a protege? Did Lucas simply study a man who had already survived everything Harlem could throw at him? Or did both men understand the relationship differently? Maybe Bumpy saw a young hustler who could be useful. Maybe Lucas saw an opportunity to stand close to the most powerful man he knew. Maybe there was respect. Maybe there was protection. Maybe there was even mentorship. But mentorship does not automatically mean inheritance. And that distinction would matter after Bumpy was gone, because Bumpy had only 5 years left. 5 years. That's it. From his return in 1963 to his death in 1968. 5 years to rebuild. 5 years to adapt. 5 years to decide what Harlem would look like after him. And Frank Lucas was watching. Everyone was watching. July 1968. Harlem Bumpy Johnson went to Wells Restaurant. He had been home with Mamie earlier that evening. According to Mamie's account, he later left with childhood friend Junie Bird. At Wells, his heart gave out. He was taken toward Harlem Hospital. He did not die in the arms of Frank Lucas. That is one of the points Mame Johnson repeatedly rejected when discussing the later film version of the story. She said Lucas wasn't there, and that Bumpy's death occurred at Wells' restaurant, not in the dramatic circumstances depicted by Hollywood. But by then, something else was already beginning. The old world was ending. The new world was waiting. And Frank Lucas was still there, close enough to Bumpy to know what his name meant, close enough to understand what happened when a man controlled Harlem, close enough to see what happened when that man disappeared. 3 years later, Frank Lucas would be operating on a scale that made his own name impossible to ignore. But that came later. For now, the room was quiet, Bumpy was gone, and Harlem had a question nobody could answer yet. Who had actually been standing beside him all those years? Because Frank Lucas would eventually tell the world one story. Mamie Johnson would tell another. And somewhere between those two versions was the real relationship. Not the movie, not the legend, the man, and the young man who watched him. The next chapter begins there, not with Frank Lucas at the top, but with a younger Frank Lucas standing at the edge of Bumpy Johnson's world, trying to might understand how a man could command Harlem without ever needing to explain why. 1963. The train crossed the bridge into Manhattan. Bumpy Johnson was coming home. He had spent years behind walls, under rules written by men who did not care about Harlem. Now the sentence was nearly over. The gates opened. The city was waiting. But it wasn't the city he had left. Bumpy stepped back into Harlem carrying something more valuable than money. Mirror. He remembered the streets before the war. He remembered Stephanie St. Clair, Dutch Schultz, the numbers. The men who had promised loyalty and discovered that promises became expensive when the wrong person was listening. He remembered prison too. Alcatraz had a way of teaching patience. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no street corner to control, no room to dominate, only time. And Bumpy had learned how to use it. That was the man Frank Lucas eventually encountered, not the young enforcer who had fought for Madame St. Clair, not the ambitious criminal trying to prove himself, an older man, a survivor. A man who had already watched one generation of Harlem criminals rise and fall. That mattered, because Frank Lucas was still learning. Frank had grown up in North Carolina. He was not born into Harlem's underworld. He came from somewhere else. A different accent, a different childhood, a different understanding of what power looked like. But Harlem taught quickly. The streets didn't care where you came from. They cared what you could do. Frank learned to hustle. He learned to recognize opportunity. He learned that information could be worth more than muscle. And eventually, he encountered Bumpy Johnson. The exact nature of that relationship remains disputed. But the encounter itself became one of the most important parts of Lucas's later legend. Frank would tell the story as if he had found a teacher. Bumpy had already mastered the city. Frank wanted to understand how, so he watched. That was the beginning, not a ceremony, not a handshake, not some grand transfer of power, just a young man watching an older one. And Bumpy knew how to make people watch. He didn't need to shout. That was part of the difference. Men who are uncertain about their authority often announce it. They raise their voices, they make threats. They want witnesses. Bumpy rarely needed any of that. His reputation arrived first. A restaurant door opened. Somebody looked up. A conversation became quieter. A glass stopped moving. Nobody had to say his name. That kind of authority took decades. Frank was close enough to see it, and that was an education by itself. Bumpy understood something young criminals often learn too late. Fear could control a man for one night. Respect could control a neighborhood for years. The difference was enormous. There was another thing Bumpy understood: people. He knew that Harlem was not just territory. It was families, businesses, musicians, waitresses, barbers, numbers runners, politicians, polis, preachers, gangsters. Everybody had an interest. Everybody had a weakness. Everybody knew somebody. Bumpy moved through that network carefully. He could be generous. He could be ruthless. He could protect somebody today and threaten somebody tomorrow. The contradiction was part of his power. He understood that a neighborhood didn't have to love you to respect you, but if enough people believed you were useful, you could survive almost anything. Frank was learning that too. Then came the question of drugs. By the time Bumpy returned from prison in 1963, Harlem's criminal economy had changed dramatically. The old numbers racket was still there, but heroin had become something larger, more profitable, more international, more dangerous. Bumpy understood the business. He also understood the risks. Frank saw the opportunity differently. To him, the future wasn't necessarily behind Bumpy. It might be somewhere beyond him. That distinction would eventually separate the two men. But not yet. For a while, they occupied the same world. And Frank could watch Bumpy make decisions. He could see which men Bumpy trusted, which men he avoided, which deals he accepted, which ones he rejected. He could watch how Bumpy handled pressure. That was worth more than any speech, because Bumpy's greatest lesson may never have been something he actually said. It may have been what Frank saw him do. But there was a problem. Bumpy was not immortal. Nobody in Harlem was, and prison had taken years from him. When he returned, the clock was already running. 5 years. That's roughly what remained. 5 years before his heart stopped at Wells Restaurant in July 1968, Frank had much more time, and time changes ambition. A young man standing beside an established king eventually begins wondering what happens when the king leaves. Frank was no different. He watched, he learned, and eventually, he wanted his own name. That is where the relationship becomes more complicated, because calling someone a mentor does not mean you become their successor. Bumpy had built his position over decades. Frank would have to build his differently. Mame Johnson remembered the difference. She was there when Bumpy came home. She knew his friends. She knew his habits. She knew who belonged at the table and who didn't. And years later, when Hollywood turned Bumpy and Frank into something resembling family, she objected strongly. She rejected the idea that Lucas had been Bumpy's right-hand man. She described him as someone who followed Bumpy around, someone who wanted proximity. That doesn't mean Lucas learned nothing from Bumpy. It means the relationship may have been much less formal than Lucas later described. And that distinction matters, because history often remembers the loudest version, not necessarily the most accurate one. Imagine Harlem in those years, late afternoon, cars moving along Lenox, smoke coming from restaurant kitchens, men standing outside storefronts, pretending they weren't watching each other, a young Frank Lucas somewhere nearby, an older Bumpy Johnson walking through the neighborhood. One man was looking at the present, the other was looking at the future. Neither could see the end yet, but the difference was already there. Bumpy had survived the old Harlem. Frank was preparing for the new one, and that new Harlem would be built around drugs, money concoctions, and supply lines that reached far beyond New York. That was the world Frank wanted, not simply Bumpy's world. His own, Bumpy's, power had always depended on relationships. Frank eventually built his reputation around independence. That's why the later story is so interesting. If Bumpy really intended Frank to inherit everything, why did Frank need to build a completely separate empire? And if Bumpy never trusted Frank that deeply, why did Lucas later describe him as such an important mentor? The answer may be somewhere between the two versions. Bumpy may have influenced Frank without formally choosing him. Frank may have respected Bumpy without actually being his lieutenant. A young criminal can learn from a powerful man without becoming part of his inner circle. Sometimes the lesson is simply observation. Watch. Remember. Then wait. Bumpy understood that. Frank learned it. July 1968 was coming. Nobody knew it yet. Bumpy was still moving through Harlem, still talking, still meeting people, still carrying the weight of his name. But the body underneath the reputation was getting older, and the city was moving faster. The old guard was fading. The younger generation was waiting. Frank Lucas was one of them. He had spent years close enough to Bumpy to understand what his name could open. Now he would discover what his own name could open. That was the real test, not whether he could stand beside Bumpy, whether he could stand without him, because eventually, every student has to leave the classroom, and eventually, every legend has to leave the street. Bumpy's time was almost over. Frank's was beginning, but before the two stories separated completely, one final question remained. What exactly had Bumpy taught him? Nobody left a complete record. No transcript, no notebook, no list of lessons, only memories, conflicting memories, and a legend that became larger every time someone retold it. That legend would eventually become a movie, but the movie was decades away. For now, Bumpy was still alive, Frank was still watching, and Harlem was still listening. The next chapter would bring the real threat into focus, because the danger wasn't simply another gangster. It was a changing business, and Bumpy Johnson was about to discover that surviving the old Harlem did not guarantee survival in the new one. 1966 Harlem had changed again. The old numbers men were still around, but the streets were beginning to speak a different language. Heroin packages, conscience, wholesale. The money was no longer sitting entirely inside Harlem. It was moving through cities, through ports, through countries, through men who never appeared on the street corners where the money finally changed hands. Bumpy Johnson understood the danger. He had spent years learning how organized crime survived. The old Harlem system had depended on relationships with larger mafia organizations. Operators who wanted to work in Harlem often needed to recognize who already controlled the territory and pay for the privilege. Johnson had built his position inside that structure, but drugs were different. The numbers racket needed runners, heroin needed supply, and supply changed everything. A man who controlled the source could eventually control the street. That was the threat. Not one gangster, a new system. Bumpy had come home from prison in 1963. He was already older. The city had not waited for him. Neither had the criminals. According to later accounts, Johnson initially tried to move toward legitimate business after his release, even opening an exterminating company. But federal investigators continued watching him, and in 1967 he was indicted on another drug charge. The message was clear. Bumpy could leave the streets. The streets were not necessarily willing to leave Bumpy, and Frank Lucas was watching all of it. That was important, because Lucas wasn't simply a young man standing beside an old gangster. He was studying a changing economy. He saw what Bumpy's generation had built. Then he saw what was replacing it. and he wanted to understand where the next fortune would come from. There was another problem. Bumpy's name was powerful, but power had a lifespan. Men who had known him for decades were getting older. Some were dead. Some were in prison. Some had moved into legitimate businesses. The younger men didn't have the same patience. They wanted money now. They wanted territory now. They wanted recognition now. Frank was one of those younger men, and according to Lucas's own later account, Bumpy had recognized something in him. Lucas said Bumpy protected him when enemies were after him. He later claimed that there were multiple contracts out on his life, and that Bumpy intervened on his behalf. In an interview years later, Lucas described Bumpy as someone who had his back. If that account is accurate, it tells us something important. Bumpy didn't necessarily have to make Frank his lieutenant to influence his life. Sometimes protection was enough. Sometimes being spared was the lesson. But there was another voice, Mame Johnson. She remembered Frank differently. She said he was never accepted into Bumpy's inner circle. Not at the house. Not at important meetings. Not among the people she considered Bumpy's closest friends. She remembered him as a follower, someone who held Bumpy's coat, someone who wanted to stay near the man whose reputation opened doors. Two versions, same city, same man, same years, completely different relationship. And the timeline made the disagreement even harder to ignore. Lucas later claimed he had been Bumpy's driver for 15 years. 15. But Bumpy spent roughly 11 years in prison between his 1952 conviction and his 1963 release. The arithmetic doesn't cooperate. That doesn't prove Lucas never knew him. It doesn't prove Bumpy never mentored him. It does prove that the popular version of their relationship cannot simply be accepted without qualification. The dates are sitting there waiting. And dates don't care about legends. But something else was happening in Harlem. The old mafia structure still mattered. Bumpy's relationship with the Italian underworld had been built over decades. Frank was looking for something different. He wanted access, direct access, not necessarily to the old New York bosses, to the supply itself. That ambition would eventually take him far beyond Harlem. And once he discovered a way to connect Harlem's street demand to heroin coming from Southeast Asia, the scale of his operation would change dramatically. But that story belongs to the years after Bumpy. Before that happened, Frank still had to survive in Harlem. And Harlem had its own rules. A young criminal could not simply announce himself. You had to be recognized. You needed a reputation. You needed protection. You needed customers. You needed people who would move product without stealing it. You needed people who would keep quiet. And you needed someone powerful enough that other criminals would think twice before taking what belonged to you. Bumpy could provide some of that. But Bumpy could not provide everything, and perhaps he didn't intend to. That is where the mentor story becomes complicated. Lucas may have learned from Bumpy. He may even have received protection from him. But that is different from inheriting Bumpy's organization, different from being his chosen successor, different from being his right-hand man. The distinction is not small. It changes the entire story. Then came 1967. Bumpy was arrested again. Federal agents had been watching him. The investigation ended with an indictment on narcotics charges. He made bail. The trial never happened because Bumpy's heart stopped before the government could put him back in a courtroom. But the arrest revealed something. Bumpy's world was closing. The federal government was watching. The police were watching. The mafia was watching. The younger criminals were watching. And Bumpy himself knew what prison could do. He had already lost 11 years once. He wasn't going to pretend another sentence would be harmless. The pressure was building. Frank Lucas was moving in a different direction. He was becoming more aggressive. In 1966, according to biography.com, Lucas shot a local thug after a dispute over a drug deal. The incident brought him further to the attention of Bumpy Johnson. That detail matters because it shows the relationship may have been born not from some formal apprenticeship, but from the streets themselves. Bumpy saw Frank doing something. Frank saw Bumpy watching. And from there, the two men became connected. But connection is not the same as equality. Bumpy was already a name. Frank was still becoming one. And ambitious men often make one dangerous mistake. They confuse proximity to power with possession of power. Harlem had seen it before. A man stands beside somebody important. He hears the conversations. He sees the money. He learns the names. He watches who comes through the door. Then one day he tells somebody, I was there. Another day, I helped him. Eventually, he taught me. And after enough years, the story becomes, I was his right-hand man. That transformation is almost invisible. Nobody notices when it happens. But once the story becomes public, it is difficult to pull apart. Frank Lucas eventually became famous enough that his version of the past carried enormous weight. Then Hollywood arrived. But Hollywood had not arrived yet. For now, there was only Harlem, and Bumpy was still alive. July 1968. The end was closer than anyone knew. Bumpy had survived prison. He had survived gang wars. He had survived federal investigations. He had survived the old Harlem, but his body was failing, and the streets he once controlled were changing faster than ever. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy was at Wells Restaurant in Harlem when he suffered a fatal heart attack. The surviving accounts place his death there, not at his home. Later versions of the story would put Frank Lucas beside him. Mame Johnson rejected that. She said Lucas wasn't there. Lucas later told a different story, and that disagreement would become one of the defining contradictions in the Bumpy Johnson legend. But there was something bigger than the argument. Bumpy was gone, and Harlem suddenly had an empty chair. Nobody had to announce what that meant. A power structure built around one man's reputation had lost the man. The question was simple. Who would fill the space? Frank Lucas was ready, or at least he believed he was. The years after Bumpy's death would see Lucas build an organization far larger and more ambitious than the role he had occupied during Bumpy's lifetime. Biography. Com describes Johnson's death as leaving Harlem's criminal world open for Lucas's rise. But here's the uncomfortable part. If Lucas really had been Bumpy's designated successor, then his rise makes perfect sense. If he hadn't been, then something else happened. Frank didn't inherit the throne. He used the memory of the man who had occupied it. That possibility changes everything. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a younger criminal can inherit isn't money. It isn't territory. It isn't an organization. It's a name. And Bumpy's name was worth a fortune. The funeral came. Hundreds of people gathered. The old Harlem was mourning. The new Harlem was calculating. Some people were remembering the man. Others were wondering what would happen next. Frank Lucas was about to enter the next stage of his life. But Bumpy left him no empire with a ribbon tied around it. No official succession. No documented handover. No public declaration that Frank was the new boss of Harlem. What remained was reputation, mayor, and opportunity. Frank understood all three. The streets did too. And somewhere in that space between memory and opportunity, Frank Lucas began building the story that would eventually become larger than the man who came before him. But the real question was still unanswered. Was Frank Lucas truly Bumpy Johnson's student? Or was he simply the man who learned how to use Bumpy's legend after Bumpy was gone? The answer would not come from Hollywood. It would come from the people who remembered Harlem before the movie existed. And one of those people had been standing beside Bumpy long before Frank Lucas became famous. Her name was Mamie, and she had a very different story to tell. 1968. The photograph most people carry in their heads does not exist. Frank Lucas standing beside Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy sitting at the head of a table. Frank close enough to hear every decision. A young man learning from an older master. Then Bumpy dies. Frank takes over. It is clean. Almost too clean. That is why it works. But history rarely works that way. The real relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas was messier, and much harder to prove, even biography.com. While identifying Bumpy as Lucas's mentor, notes that people close to Johnson disputed how close the two men actually were. Lucas said Bumpy took him under his wing and eventually made him his right-hand man. Mame Johnson said Bumpy never trusted Lucas that deeply. Both versions cannot be true in exactly the same way, and that is where the deeper truth begins. There was a difference between being near Bumpy and being Bumpy's man. Harlem knew that difference. So did Bumpy's wife. Mame Johnson had been married to Bumpy since 1948. She knew the private world. She knew the people who came through the door. She knew who Bumpy invited to dinner. She knew who sat with him when business was discussed. And when American Gangster presented Frank Lucas as practically part of the Johnson household, Mamie objected. Strongly. She said Lucas never lived with them, never spent a night in their house, never belonged to Bumpy's inner circle. She said he followed Bumpy around and sometimes held his coat. That was the relationship as she remembered it. A coat. It sounds insignificant. It wasn't. Because a coat can tell you where a man stands. The person wearing it owns the room. The person holding it is waiting outside the room. That doesn't mean Lucas learned nothing. In fact, it may mean the opposite. A young man doesn't always need a private lesson to learn from a powerful one. Sometimes he only needs access. Watch the way Bumpy enters. Watch who stands. Watch who sits. Watch who speaks first. Watch who doesn't speak at all. Watch which names make Bumpy smile. Watch which names make the room go quiet. Those are lessons. And Bumpy had decades of them. Frank had the opportunity to watch. That part is plausible. The evidence supports that the two men knew one another, and that Lucas regarded Johnson as an important figure in his life. Lucas himself later described Bumpy as someone who protected him. In a Vlad TV interview, Lucas said that when he had multiple threats against him, Bumpy had his back and told those people to back off. But protection is not succession. That's the distinction people miss. Think about what Bumpy actually had. A reputation built over decades. Relationships with powerful men. A network that stretched through Harlem. Knowledge of the numbers business. Knowledge of the drug trade. Knowledge of prison. Knowledge of police. Knowledge of politics. And perhaps most importantly, knowledge of when not to move. Frank could learn from that, but he could not inherit decades. Nobody could. When Bumpy came home in 1963, he wasn't handing a finished empire to a young man. He was returning to a neighborhood that had continued without him. The old world had survived. But it had changed, and Bumpy had changed with it. There is another uncomfortable detail. Bumpy was not simply a criminal mastermind waiting for a successor. He had a family. He had friends. He had old relationships. Mame remembered men such as Nat Pettigrew, Junie Bird, Sonny Chance, and the Capuzza brothers as part of Bumpy's social world. Frank, according to her, did not belong to that circle. That matters because people often imagine organized crime as a simple pyramid. boss, lieutenant, soldiers, followers. But real criminal networks don't always work like that. They are social, personal, fluid. A man can be useful without being trusted. He can be protected without being loved. He can be present without being invited inside. And Frank Lucas may have occupied exactly that kind of space, close, but not family, useful, but not indispensable, watching, but not commanding. Then there is the most famous claim, 15 years. Lucas later described himself as Bumpy's driver for 15 years. Mame Johnson rejected that completely. She said Bumpy drove himself most of the time, and that Lucas drove him only a couple of times. She specifically rejected the idea of a 15-year stretch. The calendar creates another problem. Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years on a federal narcotics conviction and was paroled in 1963 after spending much of that period incarcerated. So when somebody says 15 years, you have to ask, which 15 years and where? Because history lives in those details. Maybe that is why Lucas's version became so powerful. It gave the relationship a shape, a beginning, a teacher, a student, a death, a succession. Audiences understand that story immediately, but real life doesn't always provide clean transitions. Maybe Bumpy did teach Frank things. Maybe Frank did spend time around him. Maybe Bumpy protected him. Maybe Frank absorbed more from Bumpy than anyone realized. And maybe Mame was right, that he was never part of the inner circle. Those things can exist together. That's the uncomfortable middle, and the middle is often where the truth lives. There is another possibility. Maybe Frank's greatest lesson from Bumpy was not how to become Bumpy. Maybe it was how not to become Bumpy. Think about the timing. Bumpy's power had been built through Harlem. His business depended on relationships. His influence depended on local control. His generation operated through a complicated alliance with the Italian mafia. But Frank was coming into a different era. Heroin was becoming more international. Supply chains were becoming more important. Vietnam was creating new routes and new opportunities. The world was getting larger. Frank saw that, and when he eventually built his own heroin organization, he did not simply reproduce Bumpy's old operation. He tried to change the scale. That may have been the real lesson. Don't inherit the street, tine the source. But first, Bumpy had to disappear. July 1968, Wells Restaurant, a Harlem institution. Bumpy was eating with people who had known him for years. Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, Finley Hoskins. These were names from his world, his old world. The people around him at the end were not necessarily the people Hollywood placed around him. Mame's account, published through excerpts from Harlem Godfather, says Bumpy died of a heart attack while dining at Wells' restaurant with childhood friends. That detail is almost painfully ordinary. No dramatic shootout, no final speech, no young protege catching his mentor in his arms. Just a restaurant, a table, friends, a heart that stopped, and a neighborhood that suddenly became older. Frank's version was different. Years later, he described Bumpy dying in his arms. Yet even Lucas acknowledged that he and Mame were not close, and said he would not call her a liar when discussing her account. That is important. Because even Lucas's later telling contains a concession. He knew Mamie's memory carried weight. He knew she had been there. And he knew she remembered the relationship differently. Still, the legend survived. Then Hollywood arrived. 2007, American Gangster. The story was no longer just Harlem history. It was cinema. Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas. Bumpy Johnson appeared as the older gangster, whose death opened the door for Lucas. The film presented Lucas as Bumpy's right-hand man. That single decision changed how millions of people understood the relationship. It gave the public an image, a house, a family connection, a succession, a clean handoff from one generation to another. But Mame Johnson fought that version. She had already written Harlem Godfather with Karen E. Quinones Miller, in part to set the record straight about her husband. The book specifically discusses Lucas and disputes his portrayal as Bumpy's right-hand man. She wasn't trying to protect a movie. She was trying to protect a memory, her memory, and that gives us the deeper truth. The real bond between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas may never fit neatly into the word mentor. It may have been something more complicated. Bumpy was an older man with a reputation. Frank was a younger man looking for a path. They knew each other. They crossed paths. Lucas believed Bumpy helped him. Mame believed Lucas exaggerated the relationship. Neither version erases the other completely, but the evidence does not support treating the Hollywood relationship as established fact. That is the line a serious history has to respect. Because there is a temptation when telling stories about powerful men. We want succession. We want the old king to recognize the young prince. We want the prince to learn everything. We want the king to die. And then we want the prince to take the throne. It makes perfect sense. But Harlem was never that simple. Bumpy Johnson didn't create Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas didn't simply inherit Bumpy Johnson. They belong to two different moments, two different criminal economies, two different generations. And for a short period, those worlds overlapped. That's the bond, not father and son, not necessarily master and student. Something more uncertain. A young man standing near a legend, learning what he could, remembering what he saw, and later, telling the world a story about it. The most revealing detail may be the smallest one. The coat. Mame said Lucas held Bumpy's coat. Imagine that. Not sitting at the head of the table, not making the decision, not running the room, holding the coat, watching, waiting, learning. And maybe that was enough, because years later, Frank Lucas would become powerful in his own right. He would build his own organization. He would create his own mythology. And Bumpy's name would remain attached to his story. But the man who once held Bumpy's coat eventually wanted the world to believe he had held something much larger, the throne. Maybe he had, maybe he hadn't. The surviving accounts don't let us say that with certainty. But one thing is clear: when Bumpy died, Harlem did not receive a written succession plan. There was no public declaration, no documented ceremony, no evidence that Bumpy formally handed Frank Lucas the keys to Harlem. There was simply an empty space, and Frank Lucas was ready to fill it. But that wasn't the most dangerous thing about the empty space. The real danger was what was coming into Harlem with it: a new drug economy, a new supply chain, and a young man who had learned enough from the old world to know that the future would not belong to the man who controlled the corner. It would belong to the man who controlled what arrived at the corner. And Frank Lucas was about to go looking for it. 1963, Bumpy Johnson came home with a plan. He had spent most of his adult life fighting the city. Now he wanted something different: a business, a quieter life, a little distance from the streets that had made him famous. He opened an exterminating company on 2nd Avenue. For a man who had spent decades around gambling, narcotics, and organized crime, it looked almost ordinary. But Harlem had changed while he was away, and ordinary was getting harder to find. The old numbers operators were still there. The old alliances were still there. The Italian mafia still held enormous influence over Harlem's heroin trade, and the younger men were watching. Frank Lucas was watching. Everyone was watching. Because Bumpy's return created a problem for the people who had grown comfortable while he was gone. The old boss was back, but he wasn't the same man, and neither was Harlem. Bumpy had left in the early 1950s. He returned in the 1960s. Those were not the same streets. The civil rights movement had transformed the country. Harlem had become more politically conscious. Police surveillance was intense. The old criminal organizations were still making money, but independent black operators were beginning to push against the old structure. The drug market was changing too. Heroin use had expanded in New York, especially among younger people. Research on the period shows that heroin initiation among Manhattan youth rose substantially during the 1960s and peaked around the early 1970s. That meant demand was growing, and wherever demand grows, somebody eventually asks the same question: who controls the supply? Bumpy knew the answer in the old system: the mafia. Frank wanted a different answer. For Bumpy, the problem was personal. He had spent years building relationships with the Italian underworld. That arrangement had allowed him to operate. It had also limited him. He could control Harlem's streets, but he couldn't completely control where the heroin came from. The Italian mafia had the connections. They had the international networks. They had the established supply lines, and they expected their share. Frank Lucas looked at that system and saw something else: a weakness. Why buy from somebody who bought from somebody else? Why accept a middleman's price? Why share the profit? Why not go directly to the source? That idea would eventually become the foundation of Frank's empire. But first, he needed something Bumpy already had access: knowledge, protection, a name. This is where the relationship between the two men becomes important again. Frank later said Bumpy had taken him under his wing. Mame Johnson said that was exaggerated. But even the disputed version tells us something. Frank understood that Bumpy's knowledge had value. He wanted to learn. Whether Bumpy taught him formally or Frank learned by watching is harder to establish. But the young man was looking, and Bumpy had plenty to teach: how to negotiate, how to recognize danger, how to keep people loyal, how to work around the mafia, how to survive police pressure, how to make money without appearing desperate for it. And perhaps the most important lesson: never show the other man how badly you need the deal. That was old Harlem. Frank was preparing to turn it into something new. Then the pressure came from the government. Bumpy was being watched. He had already been arrested more than 40 times over the course of his life. In 1965, he staged a sit-down protest at a Harlem police station, refusing to leave in response to what he considered excessive police surveillance of black neighborhoods. He was charged, but later acquitted. That moment tells us something about the man. He wasn't disappearing. He was pushing back. But pushing back against the police came with consequences. Every move attracted attention. Every meeting could become evidence. Every car ride could become surveillance. Every familiar face could become an informant. Bumpy had survived that world before, but he was older now, and the government had become more sophisticated. The streets were getting smaller. The pressure was getting larger. Frank had a different problem. He was still proving himself. A man like Bumpy could walk into a room because the room already knew his name. Frank couldn't. He had to build his own. In 1966, Lucas shot a local thug during a dispute over a drug deal, according to biography.com. That incident reportedly helped bring him to Bumpy Johnson's attention. That is a very different kind of introduction than Hollywood gives us. No elegant family dinner, no formal apprenticeship, no old gangster placing a hand on the young man's shoulder and saying, "You're next." A street confrontation, a gun, a reputation forming. Bumpy noticed. Frank noticed that Bumpy noticed, and suddenly the distance between them became smaller. But not equal. Bumpy was still Bumpy. Frank was still Frank. Then 1967 arrived. Bumpy's attempt at staying legitimate was collapsing. Federal agents followed him. He noticed them. He drove. The chase moved through Manhattan and into Queens before authorities caught him on the Van Wyck Expressway. He was arrested and later indicted by a federal grand jury on drug charges. No drugs were found in his car, according to the Daily Beast's account. Bumpy posted $50,000 bail and waited for trial. The irony was brutal. Bumpy had tried to step away. The government didn't believe him, and the streets didn't forget him. He was trapped between two worlds. The legitimate world didn't fully trust him. The criminal world still wanted him, and Frank was standing in the gap, watching. But Frank wasn't simply waiting for Bumpy. He was thinking bigger. According to Lucas's own later account, he wanted to become extraordinarily wealthy. He described a method he called backtracking, removing himself from distractions and mentally planning an operation from the smallest detail forward. That tells us something about the difference between the two men. Bumpy's power had been built through Harlem. Frank wanted something that could move beyond Harlem. He wasn't satisfied with controlling the street. He wanted the supply, and the supply was overseas. Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, Thailand, Vietnam. A completely different world from the Harlem numbers racket where Bumpy had started. That was the pressure building underneath everything. Bumpy represented the old architecture. Frank was looking for an exit from it. The Italian mafia still controlled much of the heroin pipeline. Frank's solution was radical. Cut them out. Go directly to the source. The idea was dangerous. It was also enormously profitable if it worked. Lucas later described his operation as bypassing the mafia's monopoly and bringing heroin directly from Southeast Asia. His memoir recounts the same basic strategy, but getting the product was only half the problem. You needed transportation, you needed corrupt contacts, you needed people willing to move it. You needed distribution, you needed protection, and you needed Harlem. That was where Bumpy's world still mattered. Frank could build a supply line thousands of miles away. But somebody still had to sell the product on the streets, and somebody still had to make sure the old powers didn't destroy him. That was the gap between ambition and execution. Bumpy understood what a mafia monopoly meant. Frank understood what bypassing it could mean. The two men were looking at the same system from opposite ends. Bumpy had survived by negotiating with powerful people. Frank wanted to eliminate the middleman. Bumpy knew how to survive inside the structure. Frank wanted to break the structure. That difference would eventually define the next generation of Harlem crime. But in 1967, neither man knew exactly how it would end. Bumpy was under federal pressure. Frank was becoming more ambitious. The mafia was still powerful, and the heroin market was expanding. The city was tightening around them. Then came the final year, 1968, the year everything changed. Bumpy was still facing the possibility of another trial. Frank was preparing for something much larger. The country itself was under enormous strain. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Cities burned. Harlem was tense. The old order felt unstable. And Bumpy Johnson's name still carried weight. But weight isn't the same as time. Bumpy had already spent too much of his life behind prison walls. He had returned determined to live differently, yet the government was still waiting, and the younger men were still moving. The streets didn't stop because an old king was tired. They simply waited for him to make a mistake. There was one more complication. Frank's story was becoming larger than his actual position. The more he succeeded, the more important Bumpy became to the story, because saying, "I learned from Bumpy Johnson" was powerful. Saying Bumpy Johnson was my mentor was stronger. Saying I was his right-hand man was stronger still. Each version moved Frank closer to the center of a history that Bumpy had spent decades building. Mame Johnson resisted that version. Her account was blunt. Frank was never accepted into Bumpy's circle. He wasn't a house guest. He wasn't a trusted member of the family. He wasn't the 15-year driver Lucas later claimed to have been. She remembered him as a distant follower. That doesn't make Frank's entire story false, but it does make it incomplete. And incomplete stories become dangerous when Hollywood finishes them. Jolie was coming. Nobody knew. Bumpy went home. He spent time with Mamie. He watched television. He talked. He made plans. Then he left with Junie Bird. He went to Wells' restaurant. And there, the pressure finally stopped. Not because the police caught him. Not because another gangster shot him. Not because Frank Lucas betrayed him. His heart simply failed. Bumpy suffered a fatal heart attack in the early hours of July 7, 1968, while at Wells' restaurant in Harlem. Biography. Com says he died surrounded by confidants and in the arms of childhood friend Junie Bird. Mame's account places the event the same way. Wells' restaurant, followed by the journey toward Harlem Hospital. She specifically rejected the later film depiction of Lucas being present. The legend would later change the scene, but the real ending was quieter, and maybe that made it more powerful. Bumpy was gone. The man who had survived Harlem's old wars was suddenly no longer there to negotiate the new ones, and the empty space was enormous. Frank Lucas saw it, the Mafia saw it, the police saw it, Harlem saw it. Everyone understood what an empty chair meant. Someone would sit in it. The question was who. Frank had been watching for years. Now he had to decide. Stay close to the old system, or build something entirely new. He chose new. And the first step was not taking Bumpy's chair. It was going around the people who had controlled the supply before him. That decision would turn Frank Lucas from a Harlem hustler into something much larger. But it would also create enemies far more powerful than anyone Bumpy had fought on Lenox Avenue. Because once Frank decided to bypass the Mafia, he wasn't simply entering the drug business. He was challenging the architecture of the business itself. And that was a fight Bumpy had never finished. Frank was about to continue it, in his own way, on his own terms, with a supply line that reached thousands of miles away. And this time, there would be no Bumpy Johnson standing between Frank Lucas and the men who wanted him stopped. The old protection was gone. The new war was beginning. July 1968, the summer air sat heavy over Harlem. Cars moved along 7th Avenue. Storefronts stayed open late. People talked on corners. Music came through open windows. And somewhere inside that ordinary night, Bumpy Johnson was running out of time. He was 62 years old. The man who had survived Harlem's wars was carrying a heart that could no longer carry him. But nobody in the street knew that. Not yet Bumpy still had enemies. He still had friends. He still had federal charges hanging over him. And Frank Lucas was still somewhere inside the changing world Bumpy had helped create. The difference was simple. Bumpy's story was nearly finished. Frank's was just beginning. Bumpy had already survived one near-death experience that most men would never have recovered from. In June 1952, he was shot by Fred Hawk Hawkins, a street tough who had ambitions of his own. The bullet nearly killed him. He survived, but the shooting became another chapter in the long record of violence surrounding his name. Then came prison, a 15-year federal sentence. Bumpy entered prison in 1954. He came out in 1963. 9 years had passed. The streets had changed. His body had changed. His position had changed. But his name had not. That was the strange thing about Bumpy Johnson. Even when he was absent, Harlem remembered him. When he returned, he tried to step away. An exterminating business, a legitimate front, a quieter life, at least. That was the appearance. But federal investigators were still interested in him, and the drug business was still interested in his name. By 1967, Bumpy was again facing a federal drug conspiracy indictment. He had posted bail and was waiting for the case to move forward when his health finally gave out. The pressure was closing from both sides. The government wanted him back in court. The streets still wanted him to be Bumpy. And age wanted something else, Rhett. He couldn't have all three. Nobody could. Frank Lucas was moving differently. He didn't have Bumpy's history. He didn't have Bumpy's relationships. He didn't have Bumpy's decades of credibility. But he had something Bumpy no longer had. Time that mattered. Frank could afford to think 10 years ahead. Bumpy couldn't. Frank could make mistakes. Bumpy had to be careful. Frank could build. Bumpy was trying to preserve. And somewhere in that difference, the relationship between them began to change. If Lucas had once looked at Bumpy as a teacher, he was now looking at the world beyond him. He wanted his own operation, his own money, his own name, and eventually, his own supply. The heroin business offered something the old Harlem numbers racket never could scale. A numbers operation was local. A heroin network could be international. The product could begin thousands of miles away and end up in a Harlem apartment. The money could move through multiple cities. The people involved might never meet. That meant the old rules were becoming less important. A man no longer had to control every street. He needed to control the pipeline. Frank understood that, and Bumpy's generation had never built its power that way. This was not simply a younger man replacing an older one. It was a different criminal economy, replacing an older criminal economy. That distinction is critical, because when Bumpy died, Frank did not simply inherit his organization. There was no documented handover, no formal declaration, no evidence that Bumpy publicly named Lucas as his successor. The historical record instead shows a younger criminal whose own ambitions were already developing before Bumpy's death. That is much less cinematic. It is also much more interesting. Then came the final night. Jolly 7, just before 2 in the morning. Wells Restaurant, Lenox Avenue. The restaurant was still open. Bumpy was there. He was eating. The waitress had just served him coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. According to later accounts of the night, there was nothing theatrical about it. No gunfire, no ambush, no waiting assassin. Just a restaurant, a plate, a cup of coffee, a man who had spent decades surviving violence. Then his hand went to his chest. He fell. The room changed. Immediately, someone called for help. Someone moved toward him. The people who knew him best understood that this was different. This wasn't another shooting. There was no enemy to fight, no man to threaten, no deal to negotiate, no prison sentence to survive. The heart does not negotiate. Bumpy was taken toward Harlem Hospital. His childhood friend Junie Bird was with him. According to May Johnson's account, Bird came to the house to tell her what had happened. She later recalled that Bumpy had left after spending the evening with her and watching television. He had gone out with Bird. That was the last time she saw him alive. The man who had survived everything Harlem could throw at him was now fighting something no reputation could intimidate. And this is where the legend breaks, because the movie shows Frank Lucas there, holding Bumpy, watching him die. The scene is powerful. It is also disputed. Mamie Johnson said Frank Lucas was not there. She said he did not attend the wake. She said he did not attend the funeral. She said she did not know where he was that night. Most importantly, she said Bumpy died at Wells' restaurant, not in the circumstances portrayed by American Gangster. Frank Lucas later told a different story. He said Bumpy died in his arms. That claim became part of the public mythology, and then Hollywood made it permanent. But a movie can make a scene memorable. It cannot make a disputed scene historical. There is another problem. The calendar. Lucas claimed he had been Bumpy's driver for 15 years. Mame Johnson rejected the claim. She said Lucas drove Bumpy only a couple of times. She remembered Bumpy driving himself. She remembered other people who had driven him decades earlier. And she pointed out the obvious problem. Bumpy had spent years in prison and only lived 5 years after returning in 1963. That doesn't prove Lucas never mattered to Bumpy. It does something more important. It forces us to ask what mattered actually means. A person can matter without being a right-hand man. A person can be protected without being trusted. A person can learn without being formally taught. And a person can remember a relationship differently from the person who lived beside the other man every day. That is the problem with legends. They turn complicated relationships into simple ones. Bumpy died. The news traveled through Harlem. Men who had known him for decades heard it. People who had feared him heard it. People who had depended on him heard it. And people who had been waiting for the opportunity heard it too. The chair was empty. That was the breaking point, not because Frank suddenly became Bumpy, because nobody could replace Bumpy. The old structure had been built around a personality, his relationships, his reputation, his memory once he was gone. Everyone had to decide whether to preserve that structure or abandon it. Frank chose abandonment. He wasn't going to spend his life being Bumpy Johnson. He was going to become Frank Lucas. That decision explains much of what happened next. Frank did not simply take Bumpy's old numbers business. He didn't simply collect the same streets. He didn't try to recreate Bumpy's organization exactly as it had been. He moved toward heroin, toward supply, toward Southeast Asia, toward a network that could operate beyond Harlem. According to Lucas's own later accounts, he sought direct connections to heroin sources in Southeast Asia, eventually building an operation that bypassed traditional mafia intermediaries. That was a completely different ambition. Bumpy had become powerful by controlling Harlem. Frank wanted to become powerful by controlling what Harlem consumed. The difference was enormous and deadly. But there was one thing Frank could not manufacture: Bumpy's history. He could not recreate the decades. He couldn't recreate the old alliances. He couldn't recreate the fear that came from hearing Bumpy's name in Harlem in the 1930s. But he could use the story, and the closer Frank had been to Bumpy, the more valuable that story became. This is why the argument over their relationship matters. It isn't just a disagreement about who drove whose car. It isn't just whether Lucas attended the funeral. It is about legitimacy. If Bumpy had truly made Frank his right-hand man, then Lucas could claim a direct connection to one of Harlem's most powerful crime figures. If he had merely followed Bumpy around, then the relationship was much smaller, still useful, still meaningful, but different. And once Bumpy was dead, nobody could ask him. That was the perfect condition for a legend. Frank would later become one of the most notorious drug traffickers in American history. He would claim enormous wealth. He would describe an international heroin network. He would become the subject of books, interviews, documentaries, and eventually a major Hollywood film. Bumpy would become part of the opening chapter, the mentor. the old king, the man who supposedly handed the young Frank his future. But the historical record doesn't give us that clean succession. It gives us something more fragmented: a relationship, a reputation, a disputed memory, and an empty chair. There is a final detail that makes the story even harder. Frank himself later acknowledged that he and Mame were not particularly close. In an interview, he said he respected her and would not call her a liar, even while maintaining his own account of his relationship with Bumpy. That matters, because it means the dispute was not simply one side accusing the other. It was memory against memory. Lucas remembered Bumpy as an important mentor. Mame remembered Lucas as someone who stayed at the edge of Bumpy's world, and the dead man in the middle could no longer explain which version was closer. The night ended. Bumpy was gone. Harlem woke up the next morning without him. The restaurants opened. The cars moved. The numbers still ran. The drugs still moved. People still needed money. The streets didn't stop. They never did. But something had changed. The man who had once represented Harlem's old criminal order was no longer there to negotiate with the new one. Frank Lucas understood that. And he understood something else. If he wanted to survive, he couldn't simply be Bumpy Johnson's former follower. He needed to become somebody whose name could stand alone. So he looked beyond Harlem, beyond New York, beyond the old mafia supply chain, and toward a place most people in Harlem had never seen: Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle, the Vietnam War. Airplanes, military personnel, heroin, a pipeline. The next phase would not be about following Bumpy. It would be about leaving Bumpy behind. And that was the real breaking point. Because for the first time, Frank Lucas wasn't standing in Bumpy Johnson's shadow. He was stepping out of it, and once he did, he would discover whether he had actually learned enough from Bumpy to survive without him. 1968. The chair was empty. Bumpy Johnson was dead. Harlem had not stopped. That was the first lesson Frank Lucas had to understand. A neighborhood does not mourn forever. The numbers still ran. The heroin still moved. The restaurants still opened. Men still stood outside storefronts, watching cars pass, and somewhere inside that movement, every ambitious criminal was asking the same question: who controls Harlem now? Frank Lucas already knew the answer: nobody. Not completely. That was the opportunity. And the danger. Bumpy had spent decades building power through relationships. Frank wanted to build it through supply. The difference looked small from the street. It wasn't. Bumpy knew who to call. Frank wanted to know where the product came from. Bumpy understood the middlemen. Frank wanted to remove them, and that meant going much farther than Harlem, farther than New York, farther than the old mafia networks: Southeast Asia. That was where the next chapter of Frank Lucas's story would begin. But before he could build an international network, he had to prove one thing: he could survive without Bumpy. The traditional heroin business in New York was dominated by established organized crime networks. They had contacts. They had money. They had transportation. They had people who could protect shipments. They also had one enormous weakness. Every middleman wanted a piece. Frank looked at the chain: source, supplier, broker, distributor, street seller, commodore. Every step added cost, every step added risk, every step added another person who could betray you. So Frank began thinking backward. If the street price was high, why not go closer to the source? If the middlemen were making fortunes, why not remove them? It was the same principle that had driven him for years. Watch. Understand, then cut out the unnecessary person. But this time, the unnecessary people were powerful. Frank's later accounts describe a journey into Southeast Asia. and direct connections to heroin suppliers. The most famous version involved the Golden Triangle and a supply chain running through Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. The details of Lucas's accounts have been disputed, embellished, and challenged by later investigations. That matters, because this chapter is not about repeating every claim as fact. It is about understanding the decision. Frank wanted direct access. That part is central to his story. And once he had it, the economics changed. He was no longer simply another Harlem dealer. He was attempting to become a supplier. That was the reckoning. There is an irony here. Bumpy had taught Frank, according to Lucas, to think strategically. But the strategy Frank eventually used was almost the opposite of Bumpy's. Bumpy had survived by staying close to the neighborhood. Frank's ambition took him away from it. Bumpy's influence was local and personal. Frank's operation would become international and anonymous. Bumpy knew the men. Frank wanted the pipeline. The student, if that is what Frank had been, was no longer copying the teacher. He was changing the lesson. And there was another problem: the mafia. Frank's direct supply strategy threatened more than profits. It threatened control. The mafia's power depended partly on its position between foreign suppliers and American street markets. If Frank could bypass those intermediaries, he could keep more money. But if he could do it successfully, other dealers could do it too. That was unacceptable. A monopoly survives because everybody believes the monopoly cannot be challenged. Frank was about to challenge it. And he was doing it without Bumpy. By the early 1970s, Lucas had become a major heroin trafficker. He built a network that brought heroin from Southeast Asia into the United States and distributed it through New York and elsewhere. His organization became associated with what he called blue magic, a highly pure form of heroin. The money was enormous. Lucas later claimed figures so large that they became part of the mythology surrounding him. But even here, caution is necessary. Many of the largest numbers associated with Lucas came from his own accounts and later retellings. The legend grew faster than the paperwork. That distinction would become important decades later. Because the bigger the legend became, the bigger Bumpy's shadow became too. Frank had escaped Bumpy's shadow. Then he discovered that the shadow was useful. People knew the name Bumpy Johnson. They knew Harlem. They knew the old stories. And now Frank could say, I knew him. I learned from him. I was there. The relationship gave his story an origin. Every empire needs one. Rome has its founders. Companies have their garages. Gangsters have their mentors. Frank had Bumpy. Whether Bumpy actually intended to create Frank Lucas was a different question. But Frank's connection to him made the story more powerful. And once the story became powerful, it became difficult to separate the man from the myth. Mame Johnson never accepted that mythology. She had watched the story grow. She had seen the movie version. She knew what Bumpy's life actually looked like, and she believed Frank had exaggerated his place in it. Her criticism was not that Lucas had never known Bumpy. It was that he had turned proximity into intimacy, a follower into a lieutenant, a relationship into a succession. That is a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Because if Lucas was never Bumpy's right-hand man, then Frank's rise was not an inheritance story. It was an independent rise, and that makes the achievement and the criminality his alone. Then came the money. Frank's operation became known for enormous cash flow. He purchased expensive homes. He wore tailored clothes. He invested in businesses. He tried to move from street criminal to wealthy businessman. That was another lesson from the old world. Money is dangerous when everyone knows you have it. Respectable wealth can be safer, at least on paper. But Frank's lifestyle became difficult to hide. Law enforcement noticed. Federal investigators noticed. The same government that had followed Bumpy eventually came looking for Frank. The cycle was repeating. A new generation, a new name, the same pressure. By the early 1970s, federal agents were building a case. They watched, they followed, they listened, they documented, and eventually they moved. On January 28, 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested in New Jersey in a major federal drug case. The investigation had targeted his organization and its international heroin connections. Biography. The man who had spent years avoiding the mafia had finally met an enemy he could not negotiate with: the federal government. This was different from Harlem. There was no neighborhood to intimidate, no reputation that could make an indictment disappear, no street corner where everybody knew who you were. There was evidence, witnesses, investigators, and time. The same thing Bumpy had learned in prison. Time. Frank was sentenced to decades in prison. He would later cooperate with authorities, providing information about corruption and other criminal activity, which helped reduce his sentence. The details of his cooperation and later legal history became another part of the complicated legacy surrounding his name. He had built an empire. Then he had helped dismantle parts of the world that supported it. The king had become a witness, the supplier had become an informant, and the legend became even stranger. But Bumpy was no longer alive to see any of it. That is the part people sometimes forget. Bumpy never saw Frank's empire. He never saw Blue Magic become famous. He never saw Frank's expensive lifestyle. He never saw the federal raid. He never saw the prison sentence. He never saw the movie. So whenever someone says Bumpy made Frank Lucas into the man he became, there is a simple chronological problem. Bumpy died in 1968. Frank's biggest years came afterward. The empire was Frank's. The consequences were Frank's. The legend, however, connected them. And perhaps that was the real inheritance. Not money, not territory, not an organization, a reputation. Frank had watched Bumpy survive long enough to understand that reputation could open doors. He learned that a name could be currency. He learned that silence could be protection. He learned that the man who knows everybody doesn't need to explain himself. But Frank also learned something else. A local king could be trapped by his own territory, so Frank expanded. Bumpy had Harlem. Frank wanted the world between Harlem and the source. That was the difference. There is a moment in every empire when ambition becomes larger than caution. For Frank, that moment had already happened. The supply chain was working. The money was coming. The organization was expanding. The old mafia structure had been bypassed. Frank had become powerful enough that his name no longer needed Bumpy's introduction. He was Frank Lucas, on his own, but the government was closing in, and that was the reckoning. Because the man who had spent years studying how Bumpy survived was about to face the one thing Bumpy had never been able to outrun: the federal government. Bumpy had gone to prison. Frank was going to prison too. Different decades, different circumstances, same lesson: no empire survives forever. Bumpy's ended with his heart. Frank's would begin ending with handcuffs. And somewhere between those two endings, the relationship between them became something else. History, a story people could argue about. A memory May Johnson would defend. A legend Frank Lucas would carry. And eventually, a Hollywood script would turn into a 2-hour version of a relationship that had never been that simple. But the most important question was still waiting. If Bumpy didn't formally hand Frank his empire, if Frank didn't simply inherit Harlem, if Mame was right that Lucas exaggerated their closeness, Then, why did the legend become so powerful? Why did audiences want Bumpy to be Frank's mentor? Why did American Gangster need Bumpy in Frank's story? Because the answer says something about how history works. People want origins. They want to know where the powerful man came from. They want a teacher. They want a moment when the future was decided. But sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes a young man watches an older man. Sometimes he takes what he can. Sometimes he remembers it differently. And sometimes decades later, the audience turns that complicated relationship into a single sentence. Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas everything. It sounds perfect. It just isn't that simple. By the time Frank Lucas became nationally famous, Bumpy had already been dead for decades. But Bumpy's name was still useful. It gave Frank's story weight. It gave the audience a doorway into Harlem. And it created a connection between two men who belonged to different eras. One built power through Harlem. The other built power through heroin. One died before the other's empire reached its peak. And that may be the most important fact of all. Frank Lucas did not become powerful because Bumpy died. He became powerful because Frank made his own choices after Bumpy died. That distinction matters, because it gives Bumpy his real legacy, and Frank his real responsibility. The reckoning was coming. The federal agents were closing in. The money was getting harder to hide. The organization was getting larger. The legend was getting bigger, and the man at the center of it was beginning to discover that the same scale that made him powerful also made him visible. Bumpy had survived by understanding the room. Frank had built something so large that eventually there was nowhere left to hide. The student had become a king, then the king became a target, and when the door finally opened, it wasn't Bumpy standing there, it was the federal government. The empire had survived Harlem. Now it had to survive America. 1975, the handcuffs closed around Frank Lucas's wrists. For years, he had built an operation designed to stay ahead of everybody else, the mafia, the police, the competition, the middlemen. He had gone from Harlem to Southeast Asia and back again. Now the government had found him. The empire that had seemed almost impossible to reach had finally become visible. And once it became visible, it became vulnerable. Frank was arrested in New Jersey in January 1975 after a major federal investigation into his heroin organization. The arrest marked the collapse of the operation that had made him one of America's most notorious drug traffickers. But the story didn't end with the arrest. It changed. Frank began cooperating with federal authorities. He provided information about other criminals and corrupt officials. The man who had spent years building an organization based on secrecy was now giving the government information about the world he had once protected. The street had taught him silence. Prison taught him another lesson. Sometimes silence has a price. Harlem had changed again. Bumpy had been dead for 7 years. The neighborhood that once whispered his name was now watching another generation rise. Frank's empire had been built partly on the idea that the old system could be bypassed, but the new system had created its own vulnerabilities. Too much money, too many people, too many moving parts. Every additional connection created another possible leak. Every shipment created evidence. Every employee created a risk. Every dollar created a question. The same scale that made Frank powerful also made him easier to notice. That was the paradox. A small criminal operation can hide in a neighborhood. An international operation eventually leaves a trail, and trails are what investigators follow. But Bumpy's name remained, even after his death, even after Frank's arrest, even after the old Harlem underworld began disappearing. Bumpy remained in stories. People remembered him differently. Some remembered the gangster. Some remembered the businessman. Some remembered the man who helped protect Harlem's black numbers operators from outside control. Some remembered his wife. Some remembered his books. Some remembered the prison years. And some remembered Frank Lucas. That last connection became stronger as the years passed, because Frank had something Bumpy never had: a national audience. Frank's story became bigger than Harlem. Interviews, books, television, newspapers. Every retelling added another layer. The man who had once been a young criminal, standing near Bumpy Johnson, was now presenting himself as a major figure in American organized crime. And with every retelling, the Bumpy connection became more useful. It gave the story an origin. It made Frank's rise feel connected to Harlem's old order. It gave him lineage. But lineage is not the same as succession. That distinction still mattered. Mame Johnson had never accepted the idea that Frank had been Bumpy's right-hand man. She had challenged it publicly. She had challenged the story in her memoir, and she continued to insist that the relationship portrayed later was not the relationship she remembered. Her version remained a problem for the clean Hollywood narrative. Because she had been there was something else she had that Frank didn't. A private memory of Bumpy, not the legend, the man. She knew how he behaved at home. She knew what irritated him. She knew who he trusted. She knew who visited. She knew who stayed away. She knew that Bumpy could be both feared and ordinary. A man could control Harlem at night and still come home and watch television with his wife. That is the part biographies often lose: the ordinary moments, the silence, the coffee, the dinner, the conversations nobody recorded. Those details don't make good mythology, but they make a person real. And Bumpy was becoming less real as the legend grew. Then Hollywood came. 2007 American Gangster. The title itself changed the conversation. Now Frank Lucas was no longer simply a criminal figure from Harlem history. He was a movie character. Denzel Washington played him. Russell Crowe played Detective Richie Roberts. And Bumpy Johnson became part of the opening architecture of Frank's rise. The movie presented a relationship that was far more intimate and direct than Mamie Johnson remembered. Bumpy appeared almost like an older father figure. Frank was the young man learning from him. Then Bumpy died. Frank stepped forward. It was emotionally perfect. It was also contested. Mame Johnson did not stay silent. She criticized the film's portrayal of her husband and Frank Lucas. She argued that the relationship had been exaggerated. She objected to the depiction of Frank as Bumpy's protege. And she rejected the famous death scene. According to her account, Frank was not with Bumpy when he died. Bumpy died at Wells' restaurant, surrounded by people who had known him for years. Not in Frank's arms, not in a dramatic handoff, not with the old king whispering his final instructions to the young successor. Just Bumpy at a restaurant, in Harlem, and then he was gone. That difference is enormous. Because the death scene is where Hollywood turns relationship into inheritance. The historical account does not. There is another reason the movie version became so powerful. It gives Frank a beginning. Every great crime story needs one. The audience wants to know: who taught him? Who protected him? Who showed him the rules? Who opened the door? Bumpy answers all four questions, at least in the movie. But real life offers a less satisfying answer. Frank may simply have been one of many young men who watched Bumpy. He may have received protection. He may have learned from him. He may have admired him. He may have exaggerated that connection later. Those possibilities can coexist, and they probably explain more than the simple mentor story. After Bumpy's death, Frank's life moved faster. The organization grew. The money grew, the risks grew. Then came the arrest, then prison, then cooperation, then release. And eventually, Frank returned to the public eye. He became a man who could tell his own story. That changed everything. Because history is often written by whoever survives long enough to tell it. Bumpy couldn't speak. Frank could. Mame could. And they told different stories. Frank never completely abandoned his version. He continued to describe Bumpy as an important influence. He spoke respectfully about him. He said Bumpy had protected him. And when Mamie disputed his account, Frank did not simply attack her. He said he respected her. He would not call her a liar. That small admission matters, because it suggests the relationship was never as simple as the movie made it. Frank had his memory. Mame had hers. The truth was probably somewhere in the space between them. But that space is difficult to film. Hollywood needs certainty. History often has none. And then there was the money, the famous numbers, the famous stories, the millions of dollars. The international network, the supposedly enormous shipments, some of those details came from Frank's own accounts. Some were repeated by journalists. Some were challenged. Some became part of popular culture without ever being firmly established. That doesn't mean Frank wasn't a major trafficker. He was. It means the legend around him became larger than the documented record in places. The same thing had happened to Bumpy. One generation created Bumpy the legend. The next generation created Frank the legend. Then Hollywood connected them. The result was a story almost impossible to separate. But something had been lost. The real Bumpy Johnson. The man who had grown up in South Carolina. The young criminal who became associated with Stephanie St. Clair. The man who fought Dutch Schultz's expansion into Harlem. The prisoner who spent years behind bars. The husband who came home to Mame. The man who tried to establish a legitimate business. The older gangster whose heart finally stopped at Wells' restaurant. All of that became compressed into one role, Frank Lucas's mentor. That is too small for Bumpy's actual life. And it gives Frank too much of Bumpy's credit. The truth is more interesting. Bumpy had already built his legacy before Frank became powerful. Frank built his own empire after Bumpy was gone. Their lives intersected. They influenced each other. But one did not simply become the other. The aftermath also revealed something else. The criminal world doesn't preserve loyalty forever. Bumpy's friends aged. His enemies died. His organizations changed. Frank's associates scattered. His empire disappeared. The money was seized. The houses were lost. The names became history. But the stories remained. That is the strange currency of the underworld. Money disappears. Reputations don't. A man can lose everything and still become famous. Sometimes more famous after losing everything. Frank Lucas became more recognizable after his empire collapsed. Bumpy became more recognizable after his death. And eventually, their names became permanently linked. There was one final transformation. Bumpy became a symbol of old Harlem. Frank became a symbol of the new drug era. The transition between them became a story about generations. The old boss, the young protege, the throne, the succession. But perhaps that is exactly the wrong way to see it. Maybe the relationship wasn't a succession at all. Maybe it was an intersection. Two men, two eras. 5 years of overlap after Bumpy returned from prison. One man nearing the end of his life. One man approaching the beginning of his greatest power. And between them, a relationship that neither history nor Hollywood could completely settle. By the time American Gangster reached theaters, most of the people who could have settled the argument were gone. Bumpy was gone. Many of his old associates were gone. The Harlem they knew was gone. Even the criminal economy they understood had changed. What remained were memories, books, interviews, court records, and stories, some accurate, some exaggerated, some impossible to verify. But one thing remained clear. Frank Lucas knew Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson's influenced the young man in some way. The exact depth of that influence remains disputed, and that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story, because sometimes the most revealing historical question is not, what definitely happened? It is, why did two people remember the same relationship so differently? That question takes us back to May, back to Bumpy's house, back to the people who knew him before Hollywood did, back to the version of Bumpy that existed before he became a character. And that is where the next chapter begins. Not with Frank Lucas, not with the movie, but with the silence left behind by the man himself, Bumpy Johnson. Because after all the money, all the arrests, all the stories, and all the Hollywood mythology, there is one thing nobody can change. Bumpy never got the chance to tell his side. The house was quiet. No reporters, no cameras, no movie crew. Just Mamie Johnson and the memories of the man she had married. By then, Bumpy had been dead for decades. Frank Lucas was gone too. But the argument between them was still alive. Who was Frank to Bumpy? A protégé? A trusted friend? A driver? A follower? Or something much smaller than the legend suggested? Mame had an answer. She had always had one, and she never softened it. She said Frank Lucas was never accepted into Bumpy's circle. Not the inner circle, not the family, not the people who came to the house. She remembered Bumpy's friends, Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, Sonny Chance, the Capuzza brothers, people who belonged to Bumpy's private world. Frank wasn't one of them. That distinction is easy to miss. But it changes the story, because a criminal organization is not simply made of people who work for the boss. There are layers. People who know the boss. People who work for the boss. People who protect the boss. People who eat with the boss. People who can call the boss at home. And then there are the people who stand outside, closest enough to see, far enough away to remain replaceable. Mame believed Frank belonged there. Outside, she remembered something even smaller. The coat. Frank, she said, was essentially someone who would follow Bumpy around and hold his coat. That image is almost the opposite of American Gangster. Hollywood gave Frank a seat beside Bumpy. Mame remembered him standing behind him. Hollywood gave him intimacy. Mame remembered distance. Hollywood gave him succession. Mame remembered proximity. And perhaps that is why the coat matters, because the coat has no mythology. It doesn't make Frank look like a kingmaker. It makes him look like a young man trying to stay close to one. But Mame did not say Frank meant nothing. She said something more precise. He was not Bumpy's inner circle man. That leaves room for another possibility. Frank could still have learned. He could still have been protected. He could still have admired Bumpy. And Frank himself later said Bumpy had protected him when he was facing serious threats. Lucas also acknowledged that he respected Mame and said he would not call her a liar when discussing their conflicting memories. That is important, because the silence around their relationship is not absolute. There are pieces, Lucas's memories, Mame's memories, historical dates, and the spaces between them. The problem is that the spaces cannot speak. Bumpy could have answered the question. He never did. He died at Wells Restaurant in July 1968, surrounded by people who knew him from his earlier life, including childhood friend Junie Bird. Mame's account places his final moments there, not in the dramatic scene later shown in American Gangster. So the one man who could have settled the argument was gone. That left two memories. and memories become dangerous when nobody can challenge them. Mame's memory was not only about Frank, it was about Bumpy. She wanted people to remember the whole man, the gangster, the husband, the businessman, the prisoner, the neighborhood figure, the man who could frighten criminals and still tell children to stay in school. In her interviews, she described Bumpy as someone who helped struggling families, paid rent for people, provided food and money for children, and encouraged young people to get an education. That was her Bumpy, not a movie character, not simply a crime boss, a complicated man, a man capable of terrible things and acts of generosity, a man who could be both feared and loved. And perhaps that contradiction was exactly what the movie couldn't fully capture. There is a strange irony in this. The more famous Bumpy became, the less room there was for the ordinary details. People wanted the gangster. They wanted the guns, the cars, the meetings, the mafia, the streets. But Mime remembered the man who came home, the man who ate dinner, the man who watched television, the man who left the house and never returned. That is why her disagreement with Frank mattered so much. She wasn't simply arguing over a movie scene. She was defending a private memory. Frank had his own memory. He said Bumpy was important to him. He said Bumpy had his back. He spoke about him with respect, and he told the story of Bumpy dying in his arms. Mame rejected that completely. She said Frank was nowhere around. She said Bumpy died at Wells. She said Frank had not been part of Bumpy's inner circle. Those aren't minor differences. They're two completely different relationships, and neither man can now be questioned. Frank died in 2019. Mame died in 2009. Bumpy died in 1968. The room is empty. The witnesses are gone. Only the stories remain. That is the silence, not the absence of information, the absence of certainty. We know Bumpy and Frank knew each other. We know Frank regarded Bumpy as an important figure. We know Mamie disputed the depth of their relationship. We know Bumpy died at Wells' restaurant. We know the movie dramatized the relationship. Beyond that, some details remain contested, and responsible history has to leave some questions open. It has to resist the temptation to fill every silence. Maybe Bumpy really did mentor Frank. Maybe the relationship was more personal than Mame remembered. Maybe Frank's memories became larger with time. Maybe Mame's memories became sharper because she wanted to defend her husband's reputation. Maybe both remembered honestly. That is possible. Human memory is not a courtroom transcript. It changes, it selects, it protects, it forgets. And when a person becomes a legend, everyone around him begins remembering the legend instead of the man. But there is one fact that remains difficult to escape. Bumpy's greatest achievements came before Frank Lucas's greatest years. Bumpy built his power in Harlem. Frank later built an international heroin organization. Bumpy died in 1968. Frank's biggest rise came afterward. That means the simplest version of the story cannot be right. Frank did not simply inherit everything Bumpy had built. He had to build something himself. Whatever Bumpy taught him, Frank eventually made his own decisions. That distinction gives both men their proper place in history. Bumpy was Bumpy, Frank was Frank, and the bond between them was real enough to matter, but disputed enough that we should not turn it into something it may never have been. The silence also explains why American Gangster had such power. The film filled the empty spaces. Where history had uncertainty, the movie gave certainty. Where witnesses disagreed, the movie gave one version. Where the relationship may have been distant, the movie made it intimate. Where Bumpy's death was quiet, the movie created a dramatic farewell. That is what cinema does. It turns fragments into scenes, but scenes are not evidence. And sometimes the most important thing a historian can say is, we don't know. So what was the real bond? Perhaps it was not father and son. Perhaps it was not master and apprentice. Perhaps it was simply a young man who understood that an older man had already mastered a world he wanted to enter. Frank watched Bumpy. Bumpy knew Frank. They crossed paths. There may have been protection. There may have been advice. There may have been respect. But the surviving evidence does not establish the clean succession that the movie suggests. And that uncertainty is where the story should end. Not with a final answer, with a question. Because Bumpy Johnson left behind a reputation. Frank Lucas left behind another. And between those two reputations sits one relationship that history still cannot completely explain: the coat, the restaurant, the stories, the silence, and the empty chair. Bumpy never got to tell us what Frank Lucas really meant to him. Maybe that is the final truth. Some relationships die with the people who live them, and sometimes the silence they leave behind is more honest than the legend. Harlem did not keep the chair empty. It never does. Men came after Bumpy. Men came before Frank. And men came after Frank. The streets changed. The money changed. The drugs changed. The names changed. But Bumpy Johnson remained. Not because he controlled Harlem forever. He didn't. Not because Frank Lucas inherited his empire. The evidence does not support that simple version. Bumpy remained because his name became part of Harlem's memory, and Frank Lucas became part of that memory too. That is the strange legacy of two men who knew each other for only part of their lives. Bumpy built his reputation long before Frank became famous. He survived the Harlem Wars of the 1930s. He operated inside a criminal world dominated by competing black and Italian organizations. He spent years in prison. He came home. He tried to change. And he died in 1968. Frank's greatest rise came afterward. That timeline matters. It tells us that Frank Lucas was not simply Bumpy Johnson's replacement. He was his own man, a criminal, a strategist, a drug trafficker who built an operation on a scale that eventually attracted federal attention. Whatever Bumpy taught him, Frank made his own choices, and he paid for them. That is why the phrase Bumpy's protege is not enough. It makes Frank smaller, and it makes Bumpy smaller too. Bumpy doesn't need Frank's later success to prove that he mattered. He had already built his own reputation. And Frank doesn't need to inherit Bumpy's empire to explain his own rise. His operation came from his own decisions, his own risks, his own network, his own ambition. The real bond is more interesting precisely because it is uncertain. Frank respected Bumpy. Mame remembered Frank differently. The historical record confirms that they knew one another, but it does not give us a documented succession. No signed agreement, no public announcement, no clear moment when Bumpy said, "This man is my successor." There is no such moment in the record we have, and perhaps there never was one. What we do have is the image of a young man watching an older man. That image may be enough, because influence does not always arrive as a speech. Sometimes it arrives through observation. A man sees how another man handles pressure, how he talks, how he waits, how he protects himself, how he treats people, how he survives. Frank spent time around Bumpy. He remembered that time as important. That is significant. But influence is not ownership. A mentor can shape a student without giving him an empire. A student can learn without becoming an heir. And sometimes the student eventually becomes something the teacher never imagined. Bumpy died before Frank reached the height of his power. That fact should always remain at the center of this story. Bumpy never saw the full Frank Lucas empire. He never saw the money. He never saw the international operation reach its peak. He never saw the federal raid. He never saw the prison sentence. He never saw Denzel Washington play Frank Lucas. He never saw his own name become part of a Hollywood story. The man at the center of the legend never got to watch the legend grow. That is the irony. Then there is Mamie. She spent years trying to preserve Bumpy's memory. Her version of the relationship matters because she was not a distant historian. She was his wife. She knew the private man. And she rejected the idea that Frank was his trusted right-hand man. Her account places Frank at the edge of Bumpy's world rather than at its center. That does not erase Frank's memories, but it prevents us from treating the movie as a documentary. And that distinction matters, because American Gangster is powerful precisely because it feels true. It has the clothes, the cars, the streets, the music, the names, the atmosphere. But atmosphere is not evidence. A dramatic scene can be emotionally accurate while being historically disputed. So perhaps the real story begins where the movie ends, not with Bumpy handing Frank an empire, not with Frank becoming the chosen successor, but with two generations meeting briefly in the same neighborhood. Bumpy represented the old Harlem. Frank represented what came next. Between them was a changing city, a changing drug market, a changing America, and a relationship that history cannot completely reconstruct. That is not a weakness. It is what makes the story worth remembering, because legends are dangerous. They simplify people. Bumpy becomes the Harlem Godfather. Frank becomes the American Gangster. The titles are memorable. The men were complicated. Bumpy could be feared and generous. Frank could be ambitious and calculating. Both built criminal reputations. Both lived with consequences. Both eventually discovered that power has an expiration date. The streets don't belong to anyone forever. Bumpy's ending was quiet. A restaurant, a heart attack, a friend beside him, a city that would wake up the next morning without him. Frank's ending was different. Arrest, prison, cooperation, public attention, then decades of people asking him to explain the past. Two endings, two legacies, one connection. And perhaps the most honest way to describe that connection is this. Bumpy Johnson was a man Frank Lucas knew. Frank learned something from him. Maybe more than we can prove. Maybe less than the legend claims. But enough for Bumpy's name to remain attached to Frank's story for the rest of his life. That's the bond, not a throne, not an inheritance, not a perfect father and son relationship, a connection between two men separated by age, history, and ambition. One watched, one was watched. Then the younger man stepped into a world the older man would never see. Years later, Hollywood would make the relationship cleaner, more dramatic, more emotional. But the real Harlem story doesn't need that. It already has everything. The old numbers racket, the Italian mafia, the prison years, the changing drug economy, the young man watching, the older man aging, the restaurant, the empty chair, the conflicting memories, and the silence. That is enough. Maybe the greatest lesson is not about crime at all. It is about history. When someone becomes famous, people begin filling the gaps. They create explanations. They connect people who may have only crossed paths. They turn influence into mentorship, mentorship into succession, succession into mythology, and eventually, mythology becomes more familiar than the truth. But the truth does not always need to be dramatic. Sometimes the truth is simply, they knew each other. They influenced each other. They remembered each other differently. And nobody alive today can completely settle the argument. Bumpy Johnson left Harlem without leaving a clear successor. Frank Lucas left Harlem with a legend. Between those two facts is the entire story. The movie gave us one version. Mame gave us another. Frank gave us his own. The historical record gives us fragments. And the responsible thing is not to pretend those fragments form a perfect picture. It is to let the uncertainty remain, because uncertainty is sometimes the most honest ending. The lights on Lenox Avenue eventually changed. The old storefronts changed. The old clubs changed. The people changed. Harlem changed. But stories have a longer life. Bumpy's name survived. Frank's name survived. And the question survived with them. Were they really mentor and student? Maybe. Were they close friends? Possibly. Was Frank Bumpy's right-hand man? The surviving accounts do not establish that clearly. Did Frank build his own empire after Bumpy's death? Yes. And that may be the most important distinction. Bumpy did not need Frank. Frank did not need to inherit Bumpy. But Frank understood the value of knowing Bumpy Johnson, and he carried that connection with him. That is why the title, Before American Gangster, matters. Before the movie, before the interviews, before the mythology. There were two men in Harlem. One had already become a legend. The other was still learning how legends were made. And somewhere between them was a relationship that history can see, but cannot completely measure. The rest became cinema. The truth stayed quieter. Some men leave behind money. Some leave buildings. Some leave enemies. Some leave friends. Bumpy left a name. Frank left another. And Harlem kept both, not as father and son, not necessarily as master and apprentice, but as two names connected by a piece of history that still refuses to become simple. The real bond between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas was never the clean handoff Hollywood gave us. It was proximity, influence, mirror, and ambition. One man showed the younger man what power looked like. The younger man eventually showed the world what he could build without him. And perhaps that is where the story should finally end. Not with a throne being passed, but with an empty chair. Bumpy was gone, Frank was on his own, and Harlem kept moving, as it always had, as it always would. Because legends die, but the streets remember.